Hey everyone. So in this episode, we are talking to Jill McClennen, and Jill teaches adult learners who are unemployed or underemployed. And she is an excellent example of how life sometimes takes you where you least expect it, but where you are most needed. So I'm really, really excited to talk to her today. Jill, how are you?
I'm excellent. Thank you so much for having me today.
Great. Okay. Well, let's start with your story. So tell us where you started and how you eventually got into teaching adults, because I know that is not was not the original intention.
Correct. I had no teaching experience when I began teaching adults. I have been in food service since I was about 16. I started working in a bakery. I've worked in restaurants, bars, hotels. I mean, I really kind of did a little bit of everything. And eventually, my husband and I moved back home from me to South Jersey, and we
Okay.
opened a bakery. So we had this cute little bakery cafe, and we did really everything there. I mean, everything was made from scratch. So we
Oh, wow.
were, most people don't realize that a lot of bakeries, when they say things are made from scratch, it's still basically a boxed cake mix. It just comes in 50-pound bags rather than the little boxes you
Okay.
buy at the grocery store. But
Okay, I know the trick now. Okay, got it. I'm gonna look out for
right. Most
that.
people don't realize that, but
No.
we really did make everything from scratch. So we were mixing our butter and our eggs and our flour and, really doing it the way that we thought was going to provide the highest quality, right? So that was our focus. And at that time, we did a lot of wedding cakes. And so one day we were doing a wedding cake tasting. And the mother of the groom said she worked at a nonprofit in a city called Camden, which was about, at that time, 45 minutes to an hour away from where we were. And she said, we're getting ready to start a culinary arts job training program, and we're looking for people that'll come and be guest chefs. Are you interested?
Oh,
And I said, oh, of course I am. Like, I think that sounds amazing. I've always been somebody that really wanted to give back as much as possible. So even now, my husband and I, we both volunteer in a lot of different areas. So I was like, this would be super cool. I get to go volunteer and teach people how to bake cake. Like, I would love that. So
amazing.
it was amazing. And we started off doing, at that time, they had 2 classes a year. And so I would
Okay.
go and I would make cake with the students, right? Again, I would bring my butter and my eggs and I'd make it from scratch and we'd make icing and I'd, show them how to fill the cakes and do a basic decorating on the cakes. And over time, we started volunteering to do other things, cookies, muffins, soups, kind of anything that they needed us to do. And
Wow.
so that was about, I guess, 7 or 8 years I volunteered, 2 to 3 times a year, going up to Camden. And I really loved it. I mean, it was just amazing how people get so excited to learn something that they never knew that you could do cake that way, or that
Yeah.
they never knew how to decorate a cake. And, I just really enjoyed being there. And I got pretty close with the chef instructor because, again, I was there constantly, so every time I would see Chef Jonathan, we would see each other at other events because our bakery was always getting awards. We
Ooh,
got best food.
amazing.
Yeah, right. We got best food artisans in the entire state of New Jersey. We were always getting like best cookies or best cakes or whatever. So I would see Chef Jonathan all over the place. And then, excuse me. And then Cathedral Kitchen had decided they wanted to start a baking program. And at that
Okay.
point, they were asking me, like, what do you think we should do? And how should we do it? And, so we were kind of giving them a little guidance. And at that time, my husband and I lived with my grandmother. We had a new baby. He was just a couple months old. And my grandmother ended up getting very sick and she died, which,
Oh, I'm
is part of
sorry.
life. I know. I mean,
Yeah.
it was a beautiful experience to be there for her, but it changed a lot for us because part of why we were able to live there for free was because we were able to keep her in her house until she was 94. So
Oh, wow.
when she
That's
died,
quite a full life, definitely.
oh, it was a beautiful life. She really had a lovely life. And when she died, though, we realized that one of us was going to have to get a job that was going to bring in more income, because what we didn't really realize when we started this business together was that really in the United States anymore, you can't do mom and pop businesses. Somebody has to
Really?
have a quote unquote real job, one that brings in a steady income, one that has health insurance, one that has all of these things that if you're a small business, especially a small food service business, it's very difficult to do. Our bakery was always great. We didn't pay
Yeah.
ourselves though.
Is that because of the competition with the bigger brands that are in the States that tend to take from the smaller businesses, would you say? Or was there another reason that you were really feeling the pinch with the business?
It's definitely partially that we couldn't compete with the prices of
Yeah.
Walmarts and ShopRites. Um, it's also food service is really tricky to make money at unless you're selling alcohol. Alcohol is like the one thing that people make money at. And
Okay.
so, we brought in a lot of money, but we put out all of that money. None of it really
Right.
went to us. It went to paying our employees and paying for all the food that we were
Of
purchasing and all
course.
the stuff. And so when we realized that one of us had to get a job, my husband started working in Philadelphia. And then I got pregnant again. And I was like, I can't do this. I can't do this by myself, run this bakery with a child and a baby on the way. And my husband was commuting to Philly, which was an hour away. And so
Yeah.
we decided that we wanted to close up our bakery, and probably move closer to Philadelphia, which is where we live now, so that Stephen didn't have to commute as far. And I ran into Chef Jonathan again at an event and I said, Hey, I know you're opening a baking program. Did you hire anybody yet to teach that? And he was like, no, we're getting ready to start that process. But we're not going to be ready for at least a year. And I was like, pointed to my giant belly. I was like, yeah, I'm probably not going to be ready for about a year anyway.
That's pretty good timing.
Oh, it
Yep.
was, yeah, it was. And actually, he was the first person I told that we were closing our bakery. And I was like, we haven't said anything yet to anybody, but we are closing. So I'm really interested in the job. And so I applied and I went through the full process. They interviewed everybody like they normally would. But one of the things that I know when I went in for my interview, they said that, because I had already volunteered there so much, they really knew how well I worked with the students. And I learned this even more over time. But one of the things that they said was, we have guest chefs that come in and they think they're just going to teach people how to cook, but they don't
Mm,
interact really well with our students because, they come from a lot of different backgrounds. They tend to come from um, a lot of trauma. They come from situations where they are maybe not really great at sitting and focusing and, paying attention to what they are trying to learn because there's so much other stuff going on. And they said, we know that you're really good working with our students. And so I got the job. And
amazing. Cool.
I know, I was so excited about it. And, when I came in, again, no teaching background at all. I have an associate's degree in culinary and baking arts. Like, that's it. That's all the college education I have.
Okay.
And so I was like, all right, I'm going to figure this out. And we got the course book that we were going to use and I developed a whole curriculum. I mean, I put so much effort into developing a teaching program so that we would go through everything that they needed to learn. But I had to really switch my focus because again, I'm what they would really you would consider like classically trained pastry chef.
Mhm.
Um,
Right.
and some of these skills, they're not really realistic, right? You're not going to use them in your day-to-day work. So I really wanted to make sure that my focus was on teaching my students the skills that they needed to go out and get a job in food service, whether it was culinary or baking,
Right.
not the things that, yes, it's fun to learn how to, do sugar sculptures and chocolate sculptures and all those things. But even hotels don't really do them anymore because, again, people don't want to pay for that type of stuff. So I really tried to focus it on what was going to help them get a job that they were going to be able to thrive in and have the skills that they needed. And so I just did it. I don't know. I figured it out
Yeah,
as I went.
I was just going to say, so as someone who's not tech, like trained as a teacher, when you were preparing the curriculum itself, how challenging was that to sort of link it into cooking? Or did you just work with, okay, we're going to do this unit? Did you sort of separate it into units and then decide what to teach, like what skills to teach within that unit? Was that kind of how you developed it?
Yeah, I tried to take the way that my college did it as far as breaking up
Okay.
the classes by different themes and starting at the beginning and then building, right? So I started
Okay.
off with some culinary and baking history. And I started off teaching them about different ingredients and what the different ingredients do because people think, oh, well, you have sugar, you have flour, you have eggs, you have milk, right? That's what you use for most baking products, right? That's kind of the base. But what do those different ingredients do? What do they do at different ratios? And we did talk even about culinary math. People don't realize how often we use math in baking. It's simple math. It's not like we're getting super technical, but you really do have to understand how to scale recipes up and down to make them bigger or smaller, but not change it. If I make one cookie versus 100 cookies, they should taste the same, but I'm not going to use
Right.
the same amount of ingredients, right? So I taught my students how to do that. And I tried to kind of, again, start with the way that my university did it, but then really focus on what was going to be the most important. And over the years, it changed. I started off teaching some things and then changed it to other things. I figured out what was the most needed versus what's really interesting. Because sometimes there's things that, again, people think it's interesting, they think it's cool, but it's not really going to help you. So I kind of changed things over time. But developing the curriculum was definitely, it was a project. But I'm the type of person that, when I have my mind made up, I am like focused and I was like, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do it the best that I can. And I was looking things up online of how to, even write test correctly. I didn't know how to write a quiz or a test. And at first I did some open-ended questions. And then eventually over time, I realized that if nothing else, trying to interpret people's handwriting is not necessarily a good indicator of whether they learn the information or not, because I
Right.
would spend so much time just trying to be like, I don't even know what that word is. Like some of the words that we use, especially in culinary, they might be French terms. And so my students didn't always know how to spell it. So sometimes I was like phonetically trying to read these words. And then I was like, forget this. This is dumb. I'm just going to do all true and false, all multiple choice, and then test them really on the hands-on kind of skills.
Yeah, can
Those
they
are the
actually
written
make the cake? And did you ever use any unusual ingredients that they were like, I've never seen this, I don't know what this is?
all the time. And that was one of my favorite things to do, especially because Cathedral Kitchen itself is a nonprofit, but we do a lot of different things. So we have a soup kitchen where we feed people, and anybody can come in and be fed dinner, and we do lunch on Saturdays. It's completely free. And we also kind of filter food out into the community. So we give to a lot of different schools and a lot of different organizations. So we get a lot of donations. And we
Okay.
get really big donations. So I don't know if you know how much like a pallet of food is, but I mean,
No.
it's a lot. It's a lot. Like thousands of pounds of food get donated.
Wow.
And so sometimes we would get things that even I wouldn't know what it is. And I'd be like, ooh, let's figure this out. Let's look it up and learn how to use it. But even,
Can
some
you give us like an
donations.
example that you remember?
So we would get a lot of produce donated that were things that I had never really used much of. Things, trying to think of some of the really interesting ones. We got like chickpea flour donated once, like lots of
Okay.
chickpea flour. And I was like, what do we do with chickpea flour? So I looked it up and there is some desserts that were made with chickpea flour. So then we started just like playing around with them. Some different ingredients, like we got different eggs that were like
Okay.
not whole eggs, but there was like powdered eggs, all different varieties. And I was like, let's play around with them, see what we could do. And even a lot of, again, a lot of the produce where people had never seen these things fresh and raw. And so we would get in, rhubarb, which rhubarb is used a lot in the spring for pies and things. It's like a
Right.
very, it's like a common thing around here. And so when we would get the rhubarb in, it's these long stalks with these giant green leaves. And it just was amazing to just play around and learn things and taste things. And sometimes, I mean, I would get everybody together. I'd bring staff in. I'd be like, let's all taste this together because I have no idea what this is going to taste like. We just threw something together to try to learn what to do with it. Excuse me. And so it was really, that was one of my favorite parts of the job, was introducing new ingredients, introducing new techniques, even for me, trying to learn new things. I would do and again, this was something that I figured out, after teaching for a little while, so if we had like a cake session or we had a cookie session or we had muffins, then I would have the students look up a recipe online, say for a
Okay.
muffin. And we would use our math and we would convert it because most recipes online are for home bakers, not professional bakers. And I was like, we are all training to be professional bakers. We're putting our cup measures aside. We're getting out our scales. We're going to learn how to scale things out. And so we would convert the recipe into, pounds and ounces versus cups. And then we would scale it up so that there would have to be 25 servings, not 5 servings. And then we would have a competition and everybody would taste everything. And I mean, it was so much fun. I love all of
I'm
just the
sure
experience.
yeah, and the students as well, I'm sure absolutely loved it. I mean, in the beginning, like what would you say were some of the main challenges you encountered with teaching? And like how did you have to kind of shift your mindset to overcome them? Like, can you give us an example of something that was like at the beginning that you had to change?
Yeah. So again, the students that I teach, they have to be unemployed or underemployed. And a lot of our students are coming from either out of the prison system themselves.
Okay.
Some were homeless, some were coming from drug addiction. Even my students that were not coming out of the prison system tend to be impacted by family members that are coming out of the prison system.
Of course.
And so there's definitely a lot of experiences that thankfully I personally had not experienced. Overall, I didn't have family members that were in prison. I didn't have,
Right.
any major drug or alcohol addictions in my family. Like I didn't have to experience these things. And there was definitely, when I first started, especially, even if I didn't realize it, there was still a lot in my mindset of like, well, people need to sit down and they need to focus and they just need to learn and they just need to pay attention, like, because that's just the way that
Right.
I was taught,
Exactly. Yep.
right?
Definitely.
Like,
That's
that's the
like
way that
most of
you're,
us.
that's the way that our school system does things. And
Yeah.
I figured out pretty early on that that was not going to work effectively with my students, that I was going to have to come in with a different mindset as far as how to work with what they were bringing in with them. Because as much as we want to say, you leave your stuff outside when you come into class, like, okay, we could say that all we want to, but the reality is that we can't leave some of these things outside. The best thing that we can do as a teacher, if you're teaching people that have a lot of trauma in their lives, a
Hmm.
lot of things going on in their lives, is to really kind of meet them where they're at. And it doesn't mean that you just let them kind of do whatever they want and not learn, but it also means that some days the learning might have to wait. We might have
Yeah.
to sit and go through some different, letting people talk about things, letting people just kind of go sometimes outside. If you're really having a hard time, just go outside, take a few breaths, take a few minutes to yourself. Like, it's okay. And so I had to really shift some of that mindset. And then also fairly early on, one of my students, he was living in a halfway house at the time, which a halfway house is just a transitional housing from prison to being completely free out on your own, right? So it's
Right.
like you have some freedoms, you're allowed to come out and go to school, you're allowed to do certain things, but you still have to go back to the halfway house. You still have things you need to do in order to not get sent back to prison.
Right.
And, he said to me one day, Chef Jill, you're a really, really great teacher. We could tell how much you care, but it's also really obvious sometimes that you don't know who we are and you don't understand where we come from. And I was like,
Mm.
all right, heard. And so I went out and I bought a bunch of books that were written by people that had been through the prison system. And they wrote about their experiences of like how they got there and what they experienced while they were in prison, what they experienced when they were getting out of prison. And it really helped me to better meet my students where they're at. Because one of the things that, again, I kind of take it for granted, I'd never really thought about this, that technology changes so quickly. If you're in prison for even 5 years, you are
Mm.
not going to have access to the phones, to the internet, to, looking for jobs, to doing things that change so much so quickly. And so my students were coming out and it's like, hey, here you go. Now try to go out and quote unquote, like have a
Yeah,
normal
build a
life.
life, right?
Correct.
Exactly. And I think
And
it says a lot about, I just wanted to say, Jill, it says a
yeah.
lot about you as well, how you're with your mindset that instead of taking any, number one, that he trusted you enough to say that. And number two, that instead of taking offense at that, right? Like a lot of people would, taking things personally, you were like, okay, how can I actually meet these students halfway? What could I do? What could I change? And there are so many books out there. So I just wanted to acknowledge you for that. I think that's fantastic. And those students, I mean, I'm quite confident that you would have changed some lives there for sure. So anyway, sorry, I just wanted to say that. So yeah, so you read some of these books and then came back and then yeah, continue on.
And thank you. I
You're
appreciate that. um,
welcome.
yeah, and it really helped me to change, again, just the way that I showed up for my students, the amount of patience and compassion that I could have for people when I can view them as doing the best that they could with the situations that they had, allowed me to really focus on, because one thing too with culinary is very, in some ways, very like military. Like you follow the
Mm.
chef's orders and you do things right. And if you don't do them right, you're like getting yelled at. And it's just the intensity of a kitchen. And I realized that one of the best things that I could do for my students, some of them never had anybody that actually believed in them, that actually said, you're doing the best you can. If you make mistakes, it's fine. Eventually I had multiple students that would kind of joke that they were going to have a t-shirt made for me that said, it'll be fine, because
I
I
love
said
that.
it so much. Every time a mistake would happen, I'm like, it's going to be fine. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. Because in the long run, it is. What's the worst that happens? We have to throw it out. And I would tell my students all the time, I'd rather have you make these mistakes here with me where we can throw it away. Where if you were working for me and it was my money that I was putting into a batch of cookies and I had to throw it
Mm.
away, I might be more upset about it. But here, we're here to make mistakes. We learn from our mistakes. And even though, yes, I was teaching them baking, in a lot of ways, I was just teaching them the skills that they needed to succeed in life and to really be able to go out there and feel confident that even when things are hard, even when it feels a little bit overwhelming, that they can get through it. And again, I didn't really think about that when I took this job. I thought, I'm going
Mm.
to go teach people how to bake and I'm going to help them get jobs as pastry chefs. And really, I learned it's a whole lot more to it than that.
Yeah, I can imagine. Did you notice the shift in the classroom, or did you started to see, like, did they speak to you differently? Did they laugh with you a little bit more? How did you see that change in them in order to know that, okay, things are getting better and maybe so-and-so needs to maybe talk about something right now? Like, what would you say were the sort of shifts that you picked up on with the students?
It definitely changed over time. And again, like, I feel like partially that one student did trust me enough to say this because
Yeah,
I really tried to constantly show up with my students in a way of, I'm not perfect either. I'm still
yeah.
learning as I go, really being honest and vulnerable and real with my students. And so I still am in touch with a lot of my graduates, like they'll reach out to me all the time about all kinds of things, whether it's help with baking or just
Like
because
life. Yeah.
exactly, because they just want to talk to me about something. And
Yeah.
I really try to keep in touch with all of them. And it, it's hard because especially we kind of had to change our program pre-COVID. Like, it's funny because I was just looking through pictures and I was like,
Hmm.
I would always take pictures of like our class and when would they'd all get their uniforms and like, I'd be really excited about that. And I had posted some pictures of like, oh, look, the class just got their uniforms, not realizing that in a couple weeks I was probably never going to see most of them ever again because
Right.
the world kind of shut down and a lot of people didn't come back. Um, but that experience, also changed me so much so that when I came back to Cathedral Kitchen after the COVID shutdown and after we kind of rearranged things, I look back on that time and I still see how much I had to learn, and I feel like I'm constantly learning and the way that I show up for my students is always changing. And the way that so many of them have come back to me afterwards and said, like, your class changed my life. I even had one guy that he dropped out of the program, I think like 6 weeks in, right? So he didn't even
Hmm.
make it that far. He dropped out because life was just, sometimes our students just can't overcome what's going on outside of school enough to come and focus. And if they drop out, with a way that it's like, they didn't get into a fight, they didn't hurt somebody, like there wasn't anything traumatic, then
Right.
they're always welcome to come back. But
Okay.
this guy showed up a couple years later, just one day, walked in, and he was like, "Hey, I was in the neighborhood. I wanted to come say hi." And he said, "And I just wanted to tell you how much you changed my life." And I was like, "You didn't even make it through the program, And he was like, "It doesn't matter." He's like, "Everything that you taught me, the way that you showed up for us, it completely changed my life. And I have a house now and I got married and, I'm working as a truck driver and I make a lot of money." And it just was one of those moments where you don't even always realize how you change somebody because at that moment it's maybe not obvious, but it
Right.
changed their path, right? And that they come back later on and it's just that impact. And that's where I really try to be very cautious of anything, negative, like
Hmm.
criticism or anything like that around students. Again, I'm always just trying to stay positive and encouraging because I also know on the other end of the spectrum, it only takes one comment to somebody of like, well, that was stupid. Why'd you do that? That really then they interpret it as like, well, I'm stupid. And it just sticks with them forever. So, like, positive and negative, those things that we say, the things that we do. And my goal really, again, I realized it's not to teach baking. My goal is just to help people start on a path that changes their life for the better and not just changes their life, but some of our students, they graduate from our program. It's the first time they ever completed anything. It was the first
Mm,
time they, a lot of my students, again, maybe didn't graduate high school. And yeah, they probably got a GED somewhere along the way, but that's not that graduation. It's not that completion of something. And so they can graduate from our program and feel really proud of themselves and their children and their parents and their siblings, like it ripples out into the community. And I love, even though I'm not there teaching full time anymore, because again, just things changed with my life. It
mm.
changed a little bit, but I still teach there part time. But I love that program so much. I love my students. I love my coworkers. I mean, I really have nothing negative to say. Cathedral Kitchen is just such an amazing organization that really is changing lives in South Jersey.
Yeah, I think definitely, there's a few things you said there that like definitely resonate with me. And I feel you're also modeling for them the way to bring more love, bring more empathy, look at the way that you speak to people, right? And really think about the way that you speak to people because you also have that capability and they may not have ever thought that they had the capability to also change someone's life. But you're one person and you've come in and you've shown them like how to be empathetic, how to love more, how to open your heart more, how to, how to speak. How did they speak to each other? Did you notice any differences in how they were also communicating with each other, like as it progressed?
We So when we start off a class, we usually have about 30 students. And,
Okay.
you get 30 different people in a space together. Um, it can be difficult, and I feel like I say it over and over and over again. You don't have to be friends with everybody. You're not going to
Right.
love everybody, but we do need to, respect each other. We need to talk to each other with respect. We need to learn to work together because, we try to make sure that we rotate teams, so everybody has to learn to work together. And it can be difficult sometimes because again, we work with a demographic of people that there tends to be a lot of trauma that can be
Hmm.
triggered by things that somebody else said or things that somebody else did. And
I'm
so,
sorry.
okay.
It's my
So,
reactions. It's the
yeah,
balloons. I know. I'm just like, this podcast has it also the positivity, it's
yeah,
fitting with balloons.
perfect. I love it. I just was startled at first.
I
uh,
know.
but so, we have had students that it can turn into physical fights, it's verbal fighting. I mean, it can get a little bit intense sometimes between our students. But we try to use it as, learning experiences. We do have social workers on staff
Okay.
that will, come in and talk with our students. And if we can get people to work through things, we really do try our best. But it's hard when, again, we don't always love the people that we're working
Of
closely with,
course, it's like a
right?
job as well, right? You work with 30 people, you're not going to get along with all of them. It's
Hmm.
inevitable. You have to build on the skills, the communication skills, and I know as well, right? You're dealing with students that they themselves have likely not come from a positive experience at school, which
Hmm.
chances are is, maybe they dropped out or whatever happened in the past. So I'm actually curious, like, because some of these students, I'm sure, might have found school difficult, what were some of the methods, the teaching methods that you used that your students really enjoyed?
It's helpful when we're doing baking because it's so hands-on, right? So I
Yeah,
try to really make sure that we're moving around a lot, right? We're not just sitting down because you're right. If somebody has not had the greatest experience in school, and then I'm like, all right, now we need to sit here and listen to me talk and read through a book. And,
yeah.
some of my students have what would be considered a sixth grade or lower reading level. We don't even know
Okay.
what the lower is, right? They could have kindergarten reading levels. We don't know. And people can get very good at faking things, right? So that people don't realize how difficult it is for somebody to read or to understand something. And
Right.
so, I had to just kind of find that balance of being like, well, we do need to do these things. We need to learn these things, but we also need to learn them hands on. And then that's where, my break during COVID, it actually helped me to focus more time on learning how to teach better because again, I had time on my hands now. So,
Right.
so the one class that I teach is something called Serve Safe, and it's how to not get people sick from foodborne illnesses, basically. It's a really
Okay.
important class. It's something that every, at least in the state of New Jersey, but a lot of the, states in the United States, you have to have one manager on duty at all times who has this certification. It's a nationally recognized certification. The book is very intense. The test itself is 90 questions long. It's very intense. So it's something that we like to give to our students because it can help them really get better jobs. It can help them get higher paying jobs if they come in
Right.
with ServeSafe. And so I was teaching it already. And, I would just have everybody read the book and we would go down the line and we would all read. Because again, that's the way it was being taught when I got there. And I knew that it wasn't the best, but at the same time, I was still teaching and trying to do everything. And so when I had that break, I was like, I'm going to figure out how to do this better. And so I started teaching after COVID Serve Safe in a way that I'm finding is more fun and it's easier for the
Great.
students. Yeah, right. It's easier for the students to really learn the information, excuse me, by so what I did was I started, so again, say we have 30 students.
Okay.
I now break them up into groups so that there's maybe 5 to 6 students per group. And so we take each chapter of the book. There's 10 chapters. Again, it's very technical information. This is like
Yeah.
college level. The wording in there is weird. We're talking about like viruses and bacteria and different words that even sometimes I can't pronounce them correctly. And so we go through the chapter, and because of the way that this test is set up, I don't even know what's going to be on it. So like we literally have to go through every single page of the book and at least touch on all the information. And so I break them up and I have them first do a mind map of the chapter themselves. And I teach them how to mind map because I'm very visual. And I realize that some of my students, that's a very visual and hands-on way of doing the information. And so some of them will draw pictures and they'll get like really into it, right? All different colors. They love doing these mind maps. And then after we're done doing the mind map, then each group presents their mind map. So not only are they talking about the information with the group, they're writing it out and then they're speaking it out to the rest of the group. So then the rest of the group is also hearing the information.
Right.
And once we're done that, then I go through the chapter and I really review and I say, hey, make sure you underline and highlight this because I see this all the time on tests. Let's make sure that we focus on these different things. I teach them how to do flashcards and I say, not everybody's great at flashcards. They might not work for you. That's fine. I even teach a technique that I learned called the memory castle,
Okay. What's
where,
that?
yeah, right. So again, I don't have the greatest memory, and I'm also somebody that's very visual. And so the way that the memory castle works is you picture a place that you're really familiar with. So I always picture my grandmother's house, the same grandmother that I talked about
Right.
earlier. I grew up in that
Yeah.
house. I know that house inside, outside, upside down. And when I demonstrate it with the students, I have students stand up and tell us your name, your favorite hobby, maybe your first pet, your favorite vegetable, whatever it is. And so say again, my name is Jill. And so I picture in my mind something that either rhymes with Jill or makes me think of Jill. And I usually will try to have that person, I picture them like standing up on the dining room or the kitchen table, right? So the weirder you can think of it, the more you'll actually remember it. So I think, okay, Jack and Jill going up the hill. So I picture like Jill with her pail of water, standing on the kitchen table. Maybe the pail of water's on her head,
Yeah.
something really silly. And
Yeah.
then we go into the dining room and I say, well, my favorite vegetable is broccoli. And so then maybe I'll see, broccoli growing out of somebody's head, right? And then we go into the next room, we go into the living room. So I'm picturing all this in my mind. And my favorite hobby is cross stitching. So like I picture, maybe the image as a cross stitch image. And then we all sit down and then I say, okay, so now, how many of those things do you remember? And you can go through your memory castle and I can
Yeah.
imagine it, right? I close my eyes and I imagine it in my head and I'm like, all right, so there's the pail of water and then there's the broccoli growing out of her head and then there's everything done as a cross stitch. Because again, we have to memorize a lot of information for this test. Some of the students love this technique and they've told me afterwards, they're like, I use this all the time now in like all
Yeah.
areas of my life. Amazing. Other students are like, that's the stupidest shit I've ever heard. And I'm like, amazing. Don't use it then. I don't care. Like,
Yeah, it's just
right?
one strategy, right?
Correct. It's one strategy. I'm just throwing them all out there for you. And so I've learned that by doing some of these different things, it's helped my students so that now by the time they graduate, like I just gave the test actually this week to the group of students that are there now. I might have one fail. It seems like almost every class I have like one person fail it the first time. And again, it's usually just they're not focusing as much as they should. They
Yeah.
have a lot going on, whatever it is. But by graduation, I've had 100% pass rate by the time that they graduate
And
because
wow,
we
congrats. That's
also, right?
fantastic.
It's like, it's that. And I have my students again yesterday, like I gave the test and they were like, thank you so much, Chef Jill, for everything that you do, for how hard you work. And I'm
Yeah.
like, no, you're working hard. I'm just guiding you. You're putting the work in. So again, there's that positive reinforcement of like, this isn't me, right? I'm not doing this. I'm just helping you learn the information in a way that works for you. Maybe it doesn't
Yeah.
work for me, but it doesn't matter if it works for me. It works for you. And so there's always that reinforcement of like, no, you're doing this, you're putting in the work, you're learning the information. And one of the things, again, like this test is very technical. So I tell my students, like, I remind them 10 times at least before the test. First off, ask me lots of questions. I can't tell you the answer. I can reword the question for you so that you understand what the question is asking, because I know that you know the answer if you know what they're asking you. And I'll look words up because there's even words again that I don't really exactly know the definition. So trying to
Yeah.
explain it to somebody, so I'll look it up on Google and I'll read them the definition of the word. I will just make sure that they understand what is being asked, because really
Right.
9 times out of 10, they'll come up to me and they'll say, I don't know the answer to this question. I'm like, all right, let's reword it. Let's talk about it. Let's narrow it down. Like my brain gets overwhelmed when I see a bunch of multiple choices. So let's narrow it down. I know that it's definitely not these two. At least now I have two options to choose from. And then if nothing else, make a guess, right? You're better
Yeah.
off making a guess than
Putting
leaving it
something
blank.
down.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So some of it is just, again, it's that encouragement. It's that, ability to just say, this is how we can learn better. This is how we could take tests better. Because, again, I don't know, for me, at least growing up, I wasn't taught how to learn. I wasn't taught how to take tests. I was taught math. I was taught English. I was taught science, and then given tests that didn't work for me because that wasn't how my brain worked. And then I was told, essentially that I was not intelligent, right? Based off of my grades. I had teachers that straight up said to me, you're going to be lucky if you graduate high school. And so I know that that doesn't work. So I had to figure out what does work. And it just took time and it took putting in that effort. I mean, that's really the biggest thing too, is again, I show up, I look very different than my students. Most of my students are people of color, and I'm this like little tiny white girl. So automatically when I show up, there's going to be this initial like judgment on who I am and how I'm going to treat them. And
Mm.
so I have to start off by just, again, being myself, being vulnerable, being real, and just saying, like, hey, we're going to figure this out together. We're going to do this together, so that they know that I'm really coming in there. And yes, I might not understand everything they go through. I might not understand really everything that they experience, but I'm trying my best. I'm trying to show up and just do the best that I can for them. It's not for me. It's really for them, because I love my
Yeah.
students so much and I want them to succeed.
I was just gonna say, what do you think are two of the biggest, I guess like lessons that your students have taught you?
Actually, you know what? One of the biggest things that they've taught me is that it is okay to not be quote unquote perfect, right? Like, I
Yeah.
didn't ever think that I was a perfectionist, but it's because it was so ingrained in me. This, like, I was so hard on myself when I would make mistakes. I was so hard on myself when I would struggle with things. Like, I was just so hard on myself about so many things. And yet, like, my students are always the first ones to say to me, like, Chef Jill, you're doing amazing. Like, you're doing so well. And so when I can experience that with
Mm,
people that I feel like, again, I'm showing up to try to help them. And yet, really,
right.
in the long run, they were helping me be more gentle with myself and to be more compassionate with myself. And again, to be told, hey, you're doing great with this, but you're terrible at
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
Okay, like, let's work on this. Let's figure it out together. And really just, my students, again, they overcome so many challenges. They come from a lot of backgrounds that they experience things that I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
And really seeing clearly that there is a big difference, at least in our country, but also it sounds like around the world, in your
Mm,
experiences based off of the color of your skin, based off of, where you were born. Like, my students, I have students that are the same age as me. And again, we were born maybe 45 minutes apart from each other. But the
mm,
fact that they are a Black woman that was born in Camden and I'm a white woman that was born 45 minutes south, the experiences that they had just from the moment they were born has set them up to have a different life than I had. And it's not fair. And sometimes it makes me so angry and it makes me so upset. But I also have learned that being angry and upset is not going to fix anything, right?
yeah.
That there's a place for that anger and that upset to really kind of like crack your heart open and to be able to say, like, oh, this is real. Again, to not take offense to it, to not feel guilt and to not feel shame. There was times when I would feel so much guilt and so much shame. I would come home to a house with, a nice bed and a shower and feel really guilty about that and feel shame that I didn't always appreciate it and just really feel some not pleasant feelings. But rather than letting that shut me down, it opened me up to say, hey, but what can I do with this? How can I go out and just help more people? How can I go out and change this so that it doesn't matter what color my skin is, so that it doesn't matter where I'm born, that we can all have the same opportunities? And so I've really learned so much that I wouldn't have been able to understand it if I didn't see it. So one more small example of that, right?
Yeah.
Where um, one of the things that we do is we go out into the city of Camden and we feed all the different halfway houses and the shelters, right? And so one day during COVID, when we were short on staff because people were sick and people were out and we had to shut things down and it was just craziness. So I was driving in Camden and I was driving with one of the local guys. He lived in Camden. Um, and we were coming up on a corner and it was like all these people out. And I was like, wow, I was like, it's not that nice out. Why is there so many people out? And and I got the, oh, Chef Jill. And like when I get that response from somebody, I'm like, uh-oh, what do I not know? And he was
Yeah.
like, yeah, he was like, we're coming up on one of the corners. And I was like, oh. And so it would start. the outer circle would be all the people using the drugs. As we got closer to the corner, there was the drug dealers set up on the corners. And then parked not too far away was an ambulance, because the ambulance knew that it was going to probably be needed. So they were there and they were waiting.
Right.
And I saw that. And I mean, my heart breaks for everybody, like I'm not looking at these young guys that are selling the drugs and thinking, oh, they're terrible people. Like, how could they be out? My heart's breaking for the people using the drugs, the ones that you're seeing that are like slumped over. It just, all of it just crushed my soul. And
Yeah.
I was like, and this guy, I'm like in the car with him, and I'm like, how can people not want to do what they can to fix this, to change this? And he was like, because people don't see it. They sit in their houses and they judge and they hear about it on TV in a way that it's like, oh, these people are bad people, whether again, they're the drug
Mhm.
addicts or whether they're the people selling the drugs. And he was like, they're all just out here doing the best they can. And if you don't see it, you're not going to be able to really understand. And seeing it firsthand, I really, and again, like I would see the little bits of it. We all have people that would come
Mm.
in, and,
Right.
we knew a lot of this different stuff. Like I know some of my students, they've, been drug dealers. Some of them have killed people, and they'll be very open with me about it. Right. Like, so I knew these things, but seeing it, being in the middle of it, it just changed me. It changed the way that I look at people in general. And,
So what do
there,
you think, Jill, the people that are sitting in their houses and not seeing it and and being judgmental, and and you do see that because you see it a lot on social media as well, and people feel the need to comment on things. What are some things that people can do, even if it's not just, obviously people can donate money, but if you, let's say, don't have the money to donate, how what would you suggest people could do to make a difference? Especially so that they themselves start to build their own empathy and their own, like, love of humanity and wanting to do better, to get rid of some of that negativity that is within them these days, right? Because I see that so often. What do you think are some ideas? I also have some ideas, but I would love to hear yours.
again, from my experience, the best thing to do is to really learn from people that have different experiences than you do. Like to really take the time to read the books, to talk to people, to put yourself in places where you're going to meet people that don't look like you, that don't have experiences like you. And when we hear their experiences, rather than the automatic reaction of either wanting to be like, well, that can't be real, right? Because like there is that
Mm,
little part of us that's kind of like, that can't really be real, to just kind of quiet that voice a little bit and really trust people that if they're saying that this is the experience they're having in the world, even if I've never seen it personally, if I've never experienced it personally, to be like, okay, like this is it. And then when you get those icky feelings that sometimes come with it, to sit with them, right? To really
mm,
allow yourself to feel the sadness, to feel the grief, to feel the shame, to feel the anger, to feel all of it. Because if we try to avoid feeling that, it's just going to shut us down, and it's going to put us back in that place of judgment of like, that's them, not me. It's because they did something bad and I don't do bad things, right? Like
yeah.
it really puts us in that place so that we're not able to open ourselves up. But we have to really be willing to sit with our own pain, to sit with our own discomfort. And then, again, I don't have a lot of money. I'm not out donating a lot of money, but I
Yeah.
do try to donate my time. I do try to donate, like at Cathedral Kitchen, that's again the example that I know the best, but I know a lot of local organizations, they just need people to come and help with things. So one of the things that we do is on our tables for our dinner guest, we put out placemats, because again, we want people to feel like you're a person. you're human. Like, we want to treat
Yeah.
you with dignity and respect. And so we get local schools to donate placemats. We get people that will make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches that then we give out to our dinner guests. We'll get high school and college students that will come in and help us clean. They'll come in and help, like, wash down the tables and the chairs once or twice a year. Like, there is ways that you can volunteer your time that doesn't require you to volunteer money, right? To give money, but you have to search
Yeah,
them out, right? We have to
absolutely.
actually, and you could do it again. Like, maybe a place like Cathedral Kitchen is not going to be your place. There is other things that you can do. There's community gardens. There's always schools that need help. I mean, there's ways that you can donate your time, but it will probably require you to face some of your own judgments, some of your own stuff, right? It is going to require some self-healing, but it's okay. Like, we can all do this. We can all sit with being a little bit uncomfortable and growing and learning and just becoming better humans in the world. Because, like you even mentioned, with like social media now, there's so much hate and anger and just not good stuff out there right now that we need that positive.
Yeah, 100%. I'm just gonna pause for 1 second because oh, okay. My husband was gonna come in here, but he sees that I'm on the thing. Okay, I'll have to cut this out. Anyways, I was I was gonna say, no, I absolutely agree with you. And I just always want to encourage people to get out of that negative downward spiral that social media comments can put you in, and rather go and look at, can I help someone today? Can I make, even just make some sandwiches, peanut butter sandwiches, and donate them if you want, or maybe not peanut butter these days, a lot of nut allergies, but but looking at if you can't, or going through your clothes, or can you donate clothes, but I think donating the time, I think people have they've almost forgotten what we can do. What area, sorry, I just gotta wait a second because my husband's gonna come in here now, so I'm gonna have to wait. Sorry, do you want to go quick? Because I'm just in the middle of an interview. It's okay. I'll cut this out. Sorry, Jill.
Okay.
I had
My
it set up
kids
so
will
we could go
bust
around the back,
in.
but
Yeah. No, it's fine.
anyways, I'll start over. Yeah, and I definitely, I think people have forgotten about donating their time because they do feel that it's I'm safe here and that's them, and I don't want to, get impacted. But that little bit of kindness and that little bit of just empathy for someone, you don't realize how far it can go. Even if, like, the waitress is slow, right? And people will now get upset with the waitress, or the teachers, the way that, parents feel that they can speak to the teachers a lot of the time, or even other colleagues can speak to the teachers. Think about what you're saying, how you're saying it, right? Really look at, what if that person has had the worst day today, and here you come and you decide that it's okay for you to just be, your worst self, or say something that could impact them even further, when you don't have to. You could just be kind. Right. So I think there's also those little moments that we forget how much of an impact we can actually have, and that there are tons of ways that you can volunteer in your area. And I would encourage everyone to look for something, and to get your kids into that as well, so that they see that as a normal thing, that, oh, you were blessed with all of this. Well, now this is, and so it's your job to actually give back to your community, right? To help someone who wasn't as blessed with so many things as you were. So I really appreciate you for saying that, because yeah, I think it'll change a lot of people if they can try that, they can do that.
Yeah. And it really is, especially to, like, there's people that are probably going to be listening and saying, well, I do volunteer. I volunteer at my church, or I volunteer, at my kid's school.
Right.
Okay, like that's great. But again, that's keeping you in your bubble. Go volunteer at a school in a lower income area that's not far from you. Go
Yeah.
volunteer, maybe you're a Christian, go volunteer at a mosque with, people that are Muslim, that are a different religion than you are. Like, get yourself out of your box because that's really where you're going to learn. That's where you're going to grow. That's where you're going to really be able to have the most impact in that it's forming these bonds. It's forming these, you know, because again, we're all so quick to judge people
Mm,
because we don't see them as people. We see them as their labels based off of what we've been taught to believe. And again, there's no shame in that. It's just part of being a human. It's the way that we've been raised. But also, that doesn't mean that that's the way we have to live our lives. It doesn't mean that
right.
that's the way we have to continue to do things. So, like, yes, volunteer at your church, volunteer at your kid's school, but also really get yourself out of your comfort zone and volunteer and do things that are something that will really push you to kind of challenge some of your judgments and some of your beliefs because I guarantee you, all of us, and me included, I know that I still have them, right? But I guarantee that you have these things within you that if you were to really take the time and get to know people that are different than you would understand that really we're more alike than we are different.
Yeah. And people are really just trying to get through life as best they can, and it doesn't, and kindness doesn't cost anything, right? And trying to go out there and understand a different culture from you, a different situation from you, seeing how you can make a difference. I think people forget how it will impact their heart as well, right? It just makes you so much of a more open person if you can spread as much love out there as possible. I think
Mhm.
that's the key. As we get into final thoughts, Jill, what books would you recommend for like personal or professional development? Or you can even give me a few of the ones that you were reading about the people who had had a bit of trauma going on in their lives.
Yeah, I mean, really, I would say probably one of the biggest things is that especially if you're a teacher, find books that your most difficult student, right? Find books that will help you learn and understand them, right? So like the books
Yeah,
that I'm reading might not apply for a lot of your other, listeners because they're not working with the same demographic that I am. Maybe they're working with children that have, special needs. So go and find books that are written by people that have experienced growing up with learning disabilities or in a wheelchair or things that you can find ways to better help them. But I mean, I know for me, one of the most impactful books that I read is a book called Righting My Wrongs by an author, Shaka Senghor. He has YouTube videos that, again, he's the one that I remember watching one of his YouTube videos and he was like, when I got out of prison, it was like Fred Flintstone stepping out into the Jetsons. Because
wow.
when I went into prison, we didn't have cell phones that fit in your pockets. We didn't have these smartphones. We didn't have all these things that we now have. And so I had to navigate a whole new world. And I was like, oh man, I'm like, I never thought about that, And so here
Yeah,
I am with my students, again, some of them had been in prison a really long time. I hadn't thought about that. And so his book, I mean, I remember taking the train and just reading his book and like sobbing on the train. And people are like looking at me and I'm like tears just like streaming down my face. But it changed me. And there was even a book that I actually tried to find it this morning. I might have actually left it at Cathedral Kitchen, but it was titled something along the lines of For White Teachers That Teach in the Ghetto, which I know like we shouldn't really call it a ghetto, but again, that was the title of the book.
yeah,
And and I went out and I read that book because I was like, all right, there's things that I need to learn. Just I need to learn to say things differently to people because
yeah,
even though I'm just acting like me, the way that it's being interpreted by my students is coming across differently than the way that I am meaning it, just because I'm talking like I always talk. Because again, I talk like a white woman that was raised
Right.
middle class. And so I had to learn these things. But again, you can't shy away from the things that are difficult. And there's definitely times when I was reading some of these books and being like, oh gosh, okay, all right, I'm such an ass sometimes. Like I
Yeah,
would
you
feel
started to
so,
see.
yeah, because again, it wasn't intentional, but just because it's not intentional doesn't mean that it's not real and it's not happening and it's not their experience. And again, I could double down and be like, well, that's not my intent, so I'm going to keep doing it. Or I could say, or I could just change the way that I say things sometimes.
Right.
So I'm going to
Yeah,
do that. Even if
absolutely.
it's hard, I'm going to do that. So
Yeah, because it will be more impactful in the end as well, right? Because you're going to continue teaching students from from areas, lower income areas and areas that are, where they're experiencing, um, not just the trauma, but also the way, like you said, the way that you say things, even though it's not intentional. The fact that you're even trying to understand how to do it, how to be better will go so far with your students, right? Just that you're trying to understand and to learn. How do you move yourself, Jill, from from a negative mindset? If you do find yourself in a negative mindset, what's your strategy for moving yourself into a positive mindset?
I like to be outside as much as possible when I'm feeling not so great. I mean,
Okay.
it's definitely been a process of figuring out that first off, I need to start my day with some movement and some meditation. Like if I don't start my day off like that, if something does come along that upsets me, it's a lot harder for me to get out of it. I get more stuck in
Right.
that spiral. So I had to have those self-care practices like kind of built into my day to prevent some of those things from happening. But really, like sometimes I will find myself frustrated and I will have to excuse myself and be like, y'all, I'm going to go stand outside for a minute and take a couple
Okay.
of deep breaths. Just to clear my head a little. So I do like to just kind of take that time to like go outside, be by myself, and just calm myself down. But I'm constantly just trying to remind myself that none of this is permanent, right? Any
Right.
feelings that I have, any experiences that I'm having, none of it's permanent. And if anything, it sounds weird to sometimes say that I almost try to view it as if I was watching like a movie or if I was already dead and I was viewing it as like a ghost, which I know again sounds really weird, but like viewing an experience that way allows me to not take it all so seriously,
Yeah, I like
to
that.
right, to kind of almost like appreciate it even more and be like, oh,
Yeah.
but I am here. I am in this experience. I have the ability to change what is happening, my
Right.
reaction, right? I can't change people. I can't change necessarily what's going on, but I can change my reaction. And so I've kind of brought some of those practices in. And then, there's some days when, like, no matter what I do, I'm just not going to feel great. And also being okay with that and saying it's all right to have bad days. It's all right to sometimes come home and just cry because I can't fix things.
Yeah.
Really just honoring all of it and not trying to push it down and ignore it.
Yeah, definitely. And if you have to tell your students that it's not a great day, I mean, being honest and authentic about that so that they also understand, where you're coming from can help a lot for sure, instead of trying to kind of fake it. What three things are you grateful for today, Jill?
Well, I'm always grateful for, the health of me and my family. That's like one of my big things. My children are healthy, my husband's healthy, I'm healthy, at least for this moment. It could change at any time, but that almost makes me more grateful for it because I'm
Yeah,
like, but for now we are. And I'm really grateful just for my life in general. It's not perfect, but I will, really sometimes look around and be like, I have nothing to complain about, again. And
Yeah.
some of that is because I've talked to students that some of their experiences, I'm like, wow, like again, I have a roof over my head, I have a comfortable bed, I have a hot shower, I have plenty of food. Like I have the things that I really need. I don't have a fancy car, but I have a car, I can get around.
Mm.
So like really just my life in general. And the fact that it is almost spring in New
Yeah.
Jersey. I'm really grateful that we're heading out of winter because I'm not a winter person. I love the spring and the summer. And so I'm starting to see some flowers popping up. And as soon as I
Nice.
see those, I'm like, oh, yes, it's almost
Yay.
time. So I'm grateful we're almost out of winter.
Oh, that's so, yeah, I can absolutely appreciate that. I just want to say, Jill, that so grateful for you that you came on the show today. And I really just appreciate your dedication to helping these students of yours develop skills that can really make such a huge impact in their lives, but also just for showing them that kindness and empathy, because I feel that is like making just even the biggest difference, right? So, and it makes me feel good that people like you are out in the world. So I just wish you really so much success and prosperity as the year goes on. And thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. This was a pleasure.
Great.